Whenever there's a plane crash, we almost always hear those two words, pilot error. It feels like the final answer, the end of the story. But what if it's not? What if that's just the beginning of a much deeper, more complicated picture? Today, we're diving into a case that really forces us to look beyond the easy answer.
Yeah, very unfortunate and irresponsible. Those are some seriously strong words, right? And they're not from a newspaper headline. They're from the Supreme Court of India. And they're talking about the initial report into a tragic Air India crash. Right away, that tells you this story is not as simple as it seems.
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. When we hear the term pilot error, is that the final conclusion, or should it be the very first clue that something much bigger is wrong? So, let's get into the details of the crash that kicked off this entire debate. Okay, so let's set the scene. It was June 12th. Air India flight AI-171, a Boeing 787, crashed in Ahmedabad. Tragically, 260 people lost their lives, and immediately the search for answers was on.
And the first official report came out fast. We're talking just 1 month later. And its conclusion? Well, it pointed the finger straight at the cockpit. The investigator said that the fuel cutoff switches were moved from run to cutoff. And in the world of aviation, that's pretty much a slam dunk for pilot error. Case closed. Or was it?
Well, not even close. The story did not end there. That preliminary report was challenged, and challenged hard. So much so that the case went all the way up to India's Supreme Court.
An aviation safety NGO started raising some major red flags. First, they pointed to a massive conflict of interest. The people investigating the crash included members from the DGCA. That's the agency that's supposed to be regulating the airline in the first place. They also demanded transparency, asking why the full flight and cockpit voice recordings hadn't been released. And then there was this really disturbing detail. Officials apparently made an unsolicited visit to the deceased pilot's family, which raised all sorts of questions about pressure and intimidation.
So to really get why that conflict of interest is such a huge deal, you just have to know who these two groups are. You got the AIB, they're supposed to be the independent detectives who figure out why a crash happened. Then you got the DGCA, they're the regulators, the ones responsible for making sure the airline is following the safety rules. Having the regulator help investigate a crash of an airline they regulate, it's kind of like letting a student grade their own homework. It just raises serious doubts about impartiality.
So with the court asking all these tough questions, the focus of the investigation started to shift, away from just the two people in the cockpit and toward the airline's entire operation.
And what started to come out wasn't pretty. Turns out, before this crash even happened, the DGCA itself had sent Air India multiple warnings about their maintenance practices. We're talking about things like using parts on planes for longer than they were supposed to. This wasn't a one-off issue. It was looking more like a pattern.
And this kicked off a huge debate you've probably had yourself. When you get on a plane and see a broken tray table or a busted screen, is that just a cosmetic thing that has nothing to do with safety? Or is it a sign of something bigger? I mean, the concern is pretty logical. If they're not taking care of the stuff you can see, what does that say about the critical stuff you can't? It's that classic tip of the iceberg question.
And when they dug even deeper, they found problems that were baked into the system for years, even back when the airline was government-owned. We're talking about a history of sloppy record-keeping, with critical maintenance data kept on, get this, Excel spreadsheets. So when they tried to move all that data to a modern system, huge gaps appeared. And you have to remember, this was all happening while they were trying to merge 4 different airlines into one. It was a recipe for chaos.
Okay, so all of this, the maintenance issues, the data problems, it all leads to this really big, fundamental shift in how experts now think about aviation accidents. It's a concept that honestly changes everything.
For decades, this number was the end of the conversation. Around 80% of plane crashes were chalked up to pilot error. It was the easy answer. But this new way of thinking challenges that entire idea.
And this slide right here is absolutely crucial. It shows the paradigm shift perfectly. The old view is simple. A pilot makes a mistake, that's the cause of the crash. Investigation over. But the new view is completely different. It says that a pilot's mistake isn't the cause. It's a symptom of deeper problems in the system. The mistake isn't where the investigation ends, it's where the real investigation begins. You have to ask, why did they make that error?
And if you want to see this new view in action, the 2020 Kozhikode crash is a perfect case study. The pilot made the error of landing in terrible weather. But the investigation didn't stop there. It linked that decision to a flawed HR policy that pressured pilots to land at their home base. They landed with a tailwind on a wet runway, and it turned out the airline had a history of that happening. And the pilot's decision-making was likely impaired by malfunctioning windshield wiper and even unprescribed medication. You see? The error was just the final link in a long chain of systemic failures.
All right, so now that we have this new framework for thinking about accidents, let's bring it all back to the Ahmedabad crash, because this new perspective is driving calls for a totally different kind of investigation.
Now, it's the pilot's own federation that's stepping up. They are formally demanding a judicial probe. They don't want the regulator involved. They want a court of inquiry led by a retired Supreme Court judge, and they want a panel of truly independent experts who know aircraft systems inside and out. They want real answers, not just a scapegoat.
And what they're demanding lines up perfectly with the guiding principle of modern aviation safety, which comes from the ICAO, the world's top aviation body. Their whole philosophy is right there. The goal of an investigation is to prevent future accidents. The purpose is not to figure out who to blame or who's liable. It's about learning, not punishing.
So really, that's what this whole story boils down to. When something terrible happens, what's our goal? Is it to find one person to point the finger at so we can all feel like the problem is solved? Or is it to do the hard work of finding the real, messy, systemic lessons that need to be learned so that we can make sure it never happens again? Moving beyond blame isn't just about one crash. It's about building a safer future for everyone who flies.